Hi, good afternoon. March 31st. We're almost to April. We're getting there, day at a time. Hope you had a good day yesterday. SAQs are looking good. I've seen a few. I'm not giving batch feedback on them yet because I still want to wait for some more to come in, but I'll be sure to go over your SAQs with you tomorrow. And remember, today I begin grading for accuracy on the do now, on the attendance activity. So make sure you go back and give it another try. If you've only done it once, try it again. Should be pretty straightforward. We're working out the kinks for how to grade those timelines, but I think you guys are getting it. We're going to pick up today where we left off yesterday, shifting from the land empires of the early modern era to the maritime empires of the early modern era. Can you name them? Can you name all of the maritime empires of the early modern era before I talk about them? See if you can do that right now. Pause, try. Could you do it? All right, yes, you're right. We're talking about the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, a little bit about the French as well. Okay, so we're going to dive right in. I'm going to share my screen with you. I promise today's lecture won't be as long as yesterday's. And here we go. European maritime empires. But first, two jokes. I got such great reviews yesterday from my "Where do generals keep their armies" joke that I'm deciding to keep it going. So here's your joke for today, actually, too. Which early modern empires that you learned about, which modern empire is the most comfortable? What do you think? It's the Ottoman Empire, of course, because they have Ottomans. And I know I look pretty young, but I was around actually at the fall of the Safavid Empire. Did you hear what happened when the Safavid Empire collapsed in the 1700s? It was a sad, scary day, and I ran. Okay, and now we're going into motivations for European exploration. So why is it in the early modern era that Europeans all of a sudden start to leave Europe and start exploring other places? Let's think about that. Last time we did an oral drill, I think you guys crushed this pretty well, but we're just going to review really quick. One of the reasons was that they heard the incredible stories of Mansa Musa and his gold. Mansa Musa, who took that Hajj across North Africa from Mali all the way across North Africa to Mecca, spreading his gold and his wealth everywhere he went, building mosques every place he was on a Friday. And news of Mansa Musa's wealth trickled into Europe over the centuries, and Europeans really started getting interested in exploring Africa, the coast of Africa, to search for the legends of Mansa Musa's gold. Another major motivation for European exploration was the fall of Constantinople that we talked about a lot yesterday, but you remember Mehmed II helps conquer Constantinople in 1453 with the help of Orban's cannon. And you guys remember from quarter one, but this cuts off European access to the Silk Roads. When Constantinople was controlled by the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines were Christian, Europeans were Christian. As we know, traders of the same religion give each other better deals, better prices. So prices went up on goods from Asia, luxury goods like silk and porcelain and spices. All the things that Europeans were getting via the Silk Road was now no longer controlled by a friendly Christian ally, but now it was controlled by a hostile Muslim enemy. So prices go up, and Europeans are worried that they're going to lose access to all their luxuries that they're getting from Asia. And There are some key technologies that allow Europeans to start exploring during the late 1400s. We've done this in an oral drill. I think you know it well, but we're just going to review those very quickly. A couple of technologies: the Mariner's Astrolabe, which uses the sun and the stars to determine latitude. So how far north and south on the planet they are when they're sailing, and you don't have any reference. You can't see land anywhere. You need to figure out, am I sailing towards Boston or am I sailing towards Miami? And the Astrolabe helps you do that. Cartography, map making with records of currents and wind patterns improved immensely over the 1400s. So Europeans are starting to get a lot more information about the world that they wanted to explore. Two key developments in shipbuilding made it much easier to sail. The first is the caravel, a very maneuverable ship that can sail with that lateen sail very easily, upwind or crosswind. And then the galleon is a larger version of a transoceanic sailing vessel that develops a little later in the early modern period, but is essential for European trade and conquest. And they put these technologies together to learn knowledge of the currents. You guys already know about the monsoon wind in the Indian Ocean, but there was a very similar current known as the Volta de Mar in the Atlantic Ocean. So you could sail out in one direction and sail back in a different direction at a different latitude. So this is all technology that helped Europeans explore. And if you remember, almost all of this technology came from East Asia. The astrolabe, the compass, a lot of the knowledge that went with cartography translated from East Asia, from the Chinese dynasties to the Middle East and the Islamic caliphates, and then eventually it makes it to Europe in places like Cordoba that were conquered by the Umayyads, and those first universities were places like the House of Wisdom. There were Europeans who went to the House of Wisdom and studied there. So all of this technology is not invented by Europeans, but they use it. And they use it very effectively to start exploring the Atlantic world, which we see here. The other thing that I just want to add is you should know this guy, Prince Henry the Navigator. He is the Prince of Portugal, the king, eventually King of Portugal in the 1400s, and he invests in European exploration. He invests in technology. He helps Europeans acquire the technology that they use. He's an adventurer and a scientist himself, and he sponsors European exploration. He says, I'm going to give you some money, and I might lose some money on this investment, but go for it. See if you can find ways down the coast of Africa. See if you can find new routes to Asia. So Henry the Navigator is a primary sponsor of European exploration. So take a break now. I want you to do a quick note check and a quick mental check. What motivated Europeans to start exploring outside of Europe, and what technology allowed Europeans to do this exploring? If you're able to write a short answer to answer both of those questions in combination, this could be a paragraph of a long essay, then you're ready to go. If you're not, you don't know how to answer those two questions, ready to go, you should pause, rewind, rewatch, and make sure your notes capture the answers to these questions. All right. So the first explorer you know is Christopher Columbus, 1492. Vasco da Gama and Bartolomé Diaz come soon after in the late 1490s. And in 1494, in the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Catholic Pope divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese. So we're going to look at these two empires first. The Spanish begin their conquest of the Americas, their exploration, seeking new routes to Asia. That's what Christopher Columbus wanted. He wanted to find new routes to Asia. He thought he could sail west and just sail right around to Asia, creating direct trade with the Ming Dynasty, bypassing the Ottoman Empire. And he was right that he could sail west. He was not right in that he could get to Asia because he ran into the Americas. But he basically established Spain as the first conqueror of the Americas. Columbus was followed by the conquistadors Hernan Cortez in the 1520s, and Cortez conquers the Aztecs. Pizarro comes later in the 1530s. He conquers the Inca in South America. And Cortez and Pizarro are both helped, they're aided by the great dying, the incredible number of deaths and the affliction that swept through Latin America after the Europeans arrived and brought their old world diseases that the Native Americans had no immunity to. They had never been exposed to these diseases before. And you can imagine very easily now in a time of COVID, how scary that would be for a new disease to arrive and spread through the Americas. But some historians estimate as many as 30 million Native Americans died because of the spread of diseases like smallpox and yellow fever in 100 years from when Columbus arrived to when the Spanish really set up shop. 30 million. It's hard to imagine, and they weren't living in close quarters like we are today. So this is a very virulent, long-lasting disease. And the Spanish were also motivated not just to find new routes to Asia, but they also had a religious motivation. The Spanish had just reconquered the Iberian Peninsula. They had just conquered the last of the Umayyads. Cordoba was conquered. This is known as the Reconquista. The heirs and the legacy of the Umayyads were known as the Moors. So these are Muslims who lived in the Iberian Peninsula. And the Spanish who conquered the Moors and returned the Iberian Peninsula to 100% Catholic rule were the same guys who then go to the Americas. So they are very much fighting for Catholicism. They want to convert people to Catholicism, or they want those people who aren't Catholic to leave. So this idea of the Reconquista motivates Spanish conquest of the Americas. And what follows the Reconquista is the Inquisition, where the Spanish religious authority basically decides that the world is either Catholic or they're heretics. And if they're not Catholic, then they're heretics. And heretics are evil. Heretics are corrupting the Catholic Church. So this is very different from like the Ottoman perception of other religions. Catholics don't see Muslims as people of the book. Catholics don't see Jews as people of the book. Spanish Catholics, I should say. Spanish Catholics don't see Muslims as people of the book. They don't see Jews as people of the book. And so what they end up doing is forcing the Muslims and Jewish people in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula to convert. And they're known as conversos. And then they go through this long process known as the Inquisition, where they don't trust that the people who said they converted actually converted. So they torture them, they put them on the wheel, they burn their feet to try to see if they truly converted to Catholicism or they were just protecting themselves and they were still Jewish or they're still Muslim. But this idea of the Inquisition and the Reconquista, the Spanish carry with them to the Americas. And so then when they get to the Americas, they really want to conquer both physically. They want to conquer the territory and get gold and glory, but they also want to conquer all the Americas for God. And in this attempt to conquer the Americas for God, for their religion, for the Catholic religion, they try to destroy the old religions, the native religions. So here we have an image that we saw earlier in the year of a Catholic church built on top of an Incan temple. This happened all over Mexico, where they built Catholic churches on top of Aztec temples, on top of Mayan temples, and in South America, on top of Incan temples, on top of Guarani temples. They basically tried to eradicate native religions and create a unified territory of good, loyal Catholics. The other thing the Spanish do once they conquer is they set up this social hierarchy based on race known as the casta system. You remember the casta system puts the peninsulares at the top, the ones who are born in Spain, but then move over to the Americas to rule, to govern. The Creoles are second in line. So these are the descendants of the peninsulares, but the ones who were born in the Americas. So they're Spanish blood. They consider themselves white Spaniards for the most part, but they weren't born in Europe. They were born in the Americas. And then below them is a mix of all different kinds of mixed races. When the first conquistadors arrived, and for hundreds of years thereafter, there were very few women who came with them. So it was mostly men who were arriving. Those men would take up wives and families with Native Americans. And so then there was this population of mestizo, of mixed European and Indian. But then the Spanish also brought a lot of enslaved Africans with them. And those enslaved Africans would start families with mestizos. Those enslaved Africans might start families with Native Americans. And so there were all these different, what Spanish considered races, but they're really genealogical ethnic groups of mixing in Latin America. And the Spanish tried to name every single one and give each one its own class and society. But the key to this is just the top. Here at the top are the white Europeans, the Peninsulares and the Creoles, and they control everything. They control the politics, they control the government, they are in control. You guys had a whole lesson on this, a whole inquiry lesson. This was our graphic organizer from that lesson. If you took good notes, this is in your notebook. We did an inquiry lesson where we looked about what caused, why did the Spanish create the casta system? We came up with some conclusions by reading primary sources that the Spanish were afraid of moral contamination, that the Spanish were afraid of the mixing of religion and race. They were also concerned that they were very low in numbers, the white Spaniards, the Peninsulares, and the Creoles. There were not very many of them, trying to control a much larger population of mestizos. And they wanted to create order out of what they thought was chaos of race mixing. So that's the Spanish. We're going to come back and talk about them again in a second. The Portuguese take a slightly different tact. Instead of trying to conquer all of the Americas, the Portuguese do conquer some of the Americas. They get Brazil, but then the Portuguese set up something known as a trade post empire. And you can see all of the areas that they conquer are small trade posts. These are little areas where they can control trade routes. So they have the Azores and Madeira and Cape Verde. These are all places, important locations for trade. Same with the Indian Ocean, same with Southeast Asia and East Africa. So the Portuguese basically set up trade posts in all of these locations. Vasco da Gama is the first most famous Portuguese. Bartolomeu Dias is the first to sail down to the Cape of Good Hope. Vasco da Gama is the first to sail from Portugal all the way to India. And once the Portuguese have established this trade route that they can get to India directly without going through the Ottoman Empire, without going through the Silk Road, their economic fortune starts to flourish. When they get to the Indian Ocean, they use the same technology, the monsoon winds that had been used since the classical era, but they're going to start establishing trade posts. And how the Portuguese really establish trade posts and how they really changed the Indian Ocean. You guys wrote a wonderful DBQ about this, is that the Portuguese bring armed weapons into the Indian Ocean trade. Before Da Gama shows up before the Portuguese show up. Indian Ocean trade was not dominated by any single society or any single group. It was multi-ethnic. There was no group that had a monopoly, and it was generally peaceful. All of these different groups were trading peacefully. No one was trying to destroy the other ones and take a monopoly. Islam is being spread, but also Buddhism is being spread. And it's generally a peaceful, diverse trade zone in which no one dominates. When the Portuguese arrive, they're going to start taking over key locations, key trade posts, and they're going to arm them. They're going to build forts, and they're going to put cannons on their forts, and they're going to put cannons on their ships. And then this is the port of Malacca. Malacca, if you have this port, it's right here in Malaysia, and you control the Strait of Malacca. So they build this fort, they put cannons on it, and they basically took control of the Strait of Malacca and said anyone who passes through the Strait of Malacca here to get to the Spice Islands, this is where all the spices are from, has to pay us a tax. They have to basically pay us a protection fee. And the Portuguese do this all over the Indian Ocean. They try to set up, this is known as the cartaz system, a tax system on anyone who's trading in Indian Ocean. And then the Portuguese actually make most of their money by becoming the chief traders. They're like a truckers union that gets 100% of the rights to truck for like Amazon. So like if Amazon took one company and said, okay, we're only gonna use this one company to ship our goods. That's how the Portuguese really made money, by doing internal trading in the Indian Ocean and using their ships with cannons on them to control that trading, to get the right to do that trading. In the Americas, and especially in Brazil, the Portuguese get very involved in sugar plantations, and they start bringing in millions of enslaved Africans from Africa to Brazil and South America. So this is their other big moneymaker, the sugar and plantation trade. Okay, check your notes again. Take a break. How and where did the Spanish establish their empire in the early modern era? How and where did the Portuguese establish their empire in the early modern era? And if you want to really push yourself, think about how you might compare them. How do the Spanish and the Portuguese compare? What similarities do they have? What differences do they have? I want you to think about that on your own. Hopefully you can answer both of these questions fairly easily. If you can't, pause, stop the video, rewind, review, make sure that today, tomorrow, and on May 14th, you can tell me where the Spanish established their empire and how they established their empire, and you can tell me where the Portuguese established their empire and how the Portuguese established their empire. All right. The next three we're not going to spend as much time on because we're going to talk about them more later, but the Dutch, the British, and the French. The Dutch, the British, and the French all establish trade posts in the Indian Ocean. The Dutch and the British are especially interested in getting control of the spice trade, getting control of the cotton trade, and they want monopolies on these very luxurious commodities that can make them a lot of money. And so they set up something known as the Joint Stock Company. The British and the Dutch both set up joint stock companies. The British and the Dutch basically displace the Portuguese. They come in after the Portuguese. They are better armed. They have more imperial support. The Portuguese enter a period of decline where they've kind of overstretched, and the British and the Dutch take advantage of that. So the British and the Dutch basically take over the Portuguese trade posts in the Indian Ocean. And they try to establish monopolies. It's not a peaceful conquest. The British and the Dutch actually go to war against each other, trying to get control of the Spice Islands. So they're fighting each other in the Indian Ocean. And they're both engaged in this idea known as mercantilism. So mercantilism is the idea that a mother country should establish colonies, and those colonies basically produce raw materials and goods that the mother country can get rich off of. So it could be gold and silver, it could be food products like corn, cotton, sugar. Cotton's not a food product. It could be raw materials like cotton. And the colony is designed to make the mother country rich. The mother country should, by definition of mercantilism, exploit the colony for its own benefit. And the British are excellent at setting up these mercantilist systems. The Dutch are also good at it. The French are also good at it. And they focus on, once they get control of the Indian Ocean, they focus on getting control of the cash crops. This is tobacco, photo of tobacco, sugar, and cotton, the three most important cash crops grown in the Americas. I'll talk about more about them tomorrow. And all three of those cash crops demand incredible amounts of labor. So the British, the Dutch, and the French all set up, all use coerced labor, chattel slavery, to help them exploit the plantations to grow these cash crops. The French are also in the mix. The French try to conquer bits of North America. They lose in the French-Indian War, 1754 to 1763. They lose to the British. They lose their colonies in India as well. And we want to talk about the French, the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War, in part because it leads to the French Revolution that we're going to talk about again. But I just wanted to remind you that the French fighting that war against the British is one of the many, many, many causes of the French Revolution. So then the French basically get pushed out of America into Montreal in Canada, and then into the Caribbean in places like Saint-Domingue. But the key advanced economic idea that the Dutch and the British introduced is the joint stock company. And the joint stock company, we talked about before, is a private company that does government business. So the government allows the joint stock company to declare war. The government says, if you're attacked, we will back you up. The joint stock company is private, and it's the origin, it kind of is a proto-capitalist entity that precedes our modern corporations. So people would invest in joint stock companies, and the joint stock company then had a lot of shareholders. So a lot of wealthy people in England would invest in the joint stock company. They would get that money. They would use that money to buy ships and cannons and hire crews. And then when they got control of the spices, they would make enormous profit, and then those shareholders would make profit. So joint stock companies, the key feature of a joint stock company is that they reduce the risk, the economic risk of this overseas exploration, which is dangerous, which is expensive. And the joint stock company allows a lot of people to invest in it. So you're not just counting on one rich king or a queen or one rich business person to fund these very expensive journeys. You can collect money from a lot of people who are all buying stock in the company, fund your company, and then everyone profits when the company succeeds. But the weird thing about the joint stock companies is that they're also representing the British government and the Dutch government, and they have a lot of weapons, and they can declare war, and they basically do whatever they want. I think the analogy I used in class was, imagine if Amazon wanted to sell in China. Amazon currently doesn't have rights to sell in China. China has its own version of Amazon. So what if Amazon wanted to get set up in China, and the United States was like, that's a great idea. we're going to give you our best weapons, our special forces, our most elite trained soldiers. You go ahead and start a war with China, get yourself set up in China so that we can all make more money back here in the United States. That's kind of how a joint stock company works. Okay, so I want you to think about how the British and the Dutch and the French are different from the Spanish and the Portuguese. I also want you to think about how all of these are different from the land empires that we talked about yesterday. So take a second, reflect on your notes, think about, do you have a solid understanding of these maritime empires? We're almost done. We're going to finish the lecture with a couple of big similarities and differences. So a lot of these empires use similar methods of control. When we framed this in quarter one, we talked about empires that assert authority and empires that cultivate loyalty. We also think about how these empires use coerced labor. So all of the empires, all of the maritime empires that we're thinking about today used coerced labor. Primarily, they're going to use chattel slavery, which we're going to talk a lot more about on Thursday. But that's the race-based slavery used for the production of cash crops. The Spanish set up the encomienda system, and all of the Americas where they conquer, where they basically enslave the Indians, and they take the Native Americans' land, and they say, okay, we're going to take your land. In exchange, we will protect you from any outside invaders, anyone who wants to attack you, and we're going to convert you to Catholicism. So that's the deal. Please take it. The Spanish also adopt the mita, another form of coerced labor used by the Inca, but the Spanish use it to mine the silver out of the mountain Potosi, and the Inca used it as a very friendly tax to build roads. It was a labor tax that they used to build roads and build their incredible road network. The Spanish use it as a form of slavery, and it kills thousands, if not millions, of Native Americans. And then the other major coerced labor system during this era in the Russian Empire is serfdom. So serfs are treated similar to slaves. They're not bought and sold like chattel slaves, but they are controlled and limited in rights similar to the enslaved Africans in chattel slavery. You guys wrote a whole essay about this, methods of control, how you assert authority by forced conversion. So we talked about the Spanish, how they force everyone they conquered to convert to Catholicism. The example of the Incan temple is destroyed, the Spanish church is built on top of it, connected to the Reconquista. This leads, though, to syncretism. The Native Americans who were conquered by Spanish don't give up their old religions. They don't give up their belief systems. They instead blend Catholicism with their native belief system. And the best example of this is the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico. The same hill where there's a religious temple to the temple of Tonantzin, the goddess of maize, was destroyed, and on that temple was built a church, and that church then became the Church of the Virgin Guadalupe. And so for many Mexicans of native descent, Guadalupe became a kind of Catholic representation of Tonantzin, the goddess of maize. The Russians also embraced forced conversion when they conquered the Siberians. They forced the people that they conquered in Siberia to convert to Russian Orthodox Christianity. There was also a movement when Peter the Great thought the Russians were a little backwards and should modernize, to force all of the men in Russia to cut off their beards. So these are ways that the Russians and Spanish assert their authority in terms of like religion and culture. And this is in stark contrast to the way the Mughals and the Ottomans did it. You remember Akbar from yesterday embraced Hinduism. He embraced Hindus into his government. He encouraged Mughal royalty to marry Hindu families. He did, however, and I didn't mention this yesterday, he banned sati, which is known as widow burning. In the medieval Hindu religion, when a husband died, it was expected that his wife would join him on the funeral pyre. And Akbar thought this was absurd, rightly, and he forbade sati, or widow burning. And Sikhism, a blend of Hindu and Islam, which keeps some Hindu traditions, but embraces monotheism of Islam, became very popular under Akbar as another great example of syncretism. So syncretism happens whether you cultivate loyalty through religious tolerance or if you assert authority through forced conversion. And the Ottomans similarly didn't force the people they conquered to convert. The Devshirme system, the millet system, and the jizya tax are all examples of Ottomans being tolerant with the religions and the people that they conquer. And the great example of Ottoman syncretism is the Hagia Sophia, which was one of the most famous churches in the world, built in the Byzantine Empire. And when the Ottomans conquer it, they, of course, realized that they should not destroy this incredible church. So very different from the Spanish. They did not destroy one of the most beautiful structures ever built. Instead, they co-opted it and made it their own. They turned it into a mosque. So those are the examples I wanted to look at today. Thank you for paying attention. Our last note check here is to think about which empires relied on asserting their authority to maintain control of their empires, and how did they do that? Which empires cultivated loyalty to maintain control of their empires, and how did they do that? So everything you need to answer all these questions is in today's lecture. Go back and watch them again. You're going to be writing LAQs about all of this next week. So this is where you want to put in the time to make sure you understand. Take good notes, review those notes, then use those notes next week when you write LEQs. All right, great to see you all, and have a wonderful Tuesday.